Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into relationships. Well, not exactly relationships, but more like why people stay in relationships even when they're not happy.
Yeah.
We've got this article here that outlines 7 common reasons, and we're going to try to break them down, and get to the bottom of this whole thing. What do you think?
Yeah. It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, we always talk about why people start relationships, but like the reasons they stay, even when things are bad, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
It says a lot about people, about the kind of pressures we all face.
Yeah, absolutely. So this article jumps right into it with reason number 1, fear. It basically says that the fear of the unknown can be so strong, so paralyzing, that it can keep people stuck, even in a bad relationship. It's like, better the devil you know. Have you ever heard
Oh,
that?
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
totally what we're talking about here. Risk aversion. Like deep down, it's human nature to stick with what we know, even if it's not great, rather than face something new and uncertain.
Yeah,
And I think we tend to focus on like all the bad things that could happen if we leave. The potential downsides.
right.
And those just feel bigger, more real than any of the good things that might happen. So we end up stuck.
Okay, so that makes sense, but how do you actually get over that fear? I mean, it's one thing to say, like, focus on the positive,
Right.
but when you're in that headspace, when you're anxious and scared, it's not that simple.
No, it's not like flipping a switch or anything. But one thing that can be helpful is to actually write down the good things that could come from leaving. Not just vague stuff, but like specific benefits, more peace, maybe a chance for personal growth, or even just the possibility of finding a relationship that actually makes you happy.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. But I mean, what about those times when the fear is like really legitimate? The article specifically talked about abusive relationships. In those cases, the fear is real, right? Oh, absolutely. That's so important to acknowledge. I mean, fear in those situations isn't irrational at all. It's about survival. Leaving an abusive relationship is different. It takes a whole other level of planning and support.
For sure, for sure. And you know what? Sometimes that fear gets all mixed up with another thing that keeps people in unhappy relationships.
What's that?
Denial. The article had this perfect analogy. It's like ignoring the check engine light in your car
Mm.
and just hoping that the problem will go away on its own.
Oh, yeah. That's perfect. Denial. It's all about not wanting to face reality, right?
Hmm.
So in relationships, people might downplay problems or, make excuses for their partner's bad behavior. They tell themselves it's not that bad or that things will magically get better.
Oh, I've seen that happen so many times. People just refusing to see the truth. But sometimes it's not even that they're refusing to see it. It's like they don't even realize the check engine light is on in the first place. Yeah. Like, how do you know if you're actually unhappy or just going through a rough patch? I mean, relationships have ups and downs, right?
Right.
Oh, definitely. That's such a good question. It all comes down to self-awareness, like being really honest with yourself. But the thing is, our brains can sometimes trick us.
Oh, how so?
Well, there's this thing called the sunk cost fallacy.
Oh, okay.
Basically, the more we invest in something, like a relationship, the harder it is to walk away, even when it's not good for us anymore.
Ah, that makes sense.
And then there's confirmation bias, where we only pay attention to things that support what we already believe, even if it's not true. So if you really want to believe the relationship is fine, you might ignore all the bad stuff and focus on the few good moments.
Wow. So it's like our own brains are working against us, trying to protect us from facing a tough reality.
Yeah, in a way. And that's why it's so important to really reflect on things and maybe even talk to someone you trust, a friend, a therapist, someone who can give you an outside perspective.
That's good advice. So we've got fear, we've got denial, but there's another big one. And this one's kind of, well, it's a tough one. Staying for the kids. The article makes this point that kids can totally pick up on unhappiness, even if you try to hide it. And they might even, learn unhealthy patterns from watching their parents.
Yeah, it's so complicated, isn't it? There's this desire to give kids stability, keep the family together, make sure they're financially secure.
Right, of course.
But then there's the other side of it. Like, what if they're constantly exposed to conflict or they see their parents using unhealthy ways to cope with things? What if they start to think that's normal in a relationship?
Yeah, like they're getting a front row seat to a bad dynamic.
Exactly. And kids, especially as they get older, they're smart. The article talked about this, how kids can see through that fake happiness if things aren't really okay underneath.
Right.
And that can be really damaging. It can break down trust and just leave them feeling confused.
Yeah. And I wonder, couldn't staying in an unhappy relationship actually do more harm than good in the long run? Like maybe they learn that it's okay to settle for less or to always put someone else's needs before their own.
That's a valid point.
Uh-huh.
And it just shows how difficult it is to make the right decision. Every family is different, and you have to really think about the impact on the kids. Put their well-being first.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about a reason that's, well, it's really common, but people don't always like to talk about it. Financial dependence.
Hmm.
This can be especially tough for like stay-at-home parents or anyone who's taken time off work to raise kids.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah.
People worry about their standard of living going down,
Yeah.
or all the legal and financial stuff that comes with separating or divorcing. It can feel really overwhelming.
Totally. I know people who have stayed in relationships for years just because they felt trapped financially.
Right.
But isn't that kind of a dangerous trap? Like, could staying in a bad relationship because of money actually hurt you financially in the long run?
You bring up a really good point. It's like a catch-22. Staying might feel like the responsible thing to do in the short term, but then you might get stuck in this cycle of dependence and miss out on opportunities to become more independent down the road.
That's true.
And, of course, if there's financial abuse going on, that's a whole other layer of complication and risk.
So what can you do if you're in that situation? How do you get out of feeling trapped?
Well, it's tough, but there's things you can do, like start learning more about finances, even if it's just little things. Figure out your budget, see if there are ways to improve your skills or maybe go back to work. Those things can give you a sense of control.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just having a plan, even a small one, can make a difference.
Yeah. It shifts your mindset. You go from feeling trapped to feeling like you have options.
Right. It's about taking back some of that control. It's about taking back some of that control, exactly. And, that kind of leads us to another reason people stay in unhappy relationships, but that hope for improvement. Which makes sense, right? Everyone wants things to get better, but at what point does that hope become, I don't know, like delusional?
Well, it's a fine line, isn't it? The article talked about this idea of passive hope versus active hope.
Okay, I'm listening.
Passive hope is like just wishing and hoping that things will magically fix themselves.
Hmm.
But active hope, that's about actually doing something, taking concrete steps to address the problems.
So it's not enough to just hope things will change. You actually have to, like, put in the work.
Yeah, exactly. Both partners need to be on board, willing to put in the effort.
Okay, so what does that look like? What kind of work are we talking about? I'm guessing like communication, maybe couples therapy.
Yeah, those are big ones. It's about creating a space where you can really talk openly and honestly, setting boundaries, and being willing to tackle those unhealthy patterns. And sometimes that means getting professional help. A therapist can help you, figure out how to have those tough conversations and learn to communicate better.
Makes sense. But what if you've tried all that, the talking, the therapy, everything, and nothing changes? How do you know when it's time to let go of that hope?
That's a really hard one. I mean, it's a personal decision,
Yeah.
but the article had a good suggestion. Look for actual positive changes, not just promises or, like, temporary fixes.
Huh.
If it's the same arguments over and over, the same issues keep popping up and there's no real progress, well, that might be a sign that the hope isn't realistic.
It's like that saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results.
Exactly. And sometimes the most hopeful thing you can do is to accept that the relationship just isn't working and move on.
It's funny, we've talked about fear, denial, the kids, finances, hope. And now I'm thinking about another reason people stay in relationships, even when they're unhappy. What will people think? The whole stigma of divorce.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Especially in some cultures or communities, even though divorce is more common now, there can still be this feeling of judgment, like you failed somehow.
Yeah, like you're breaking some kind of unspoken rule. But shouldn't your own happiness come before what other people think?
In theory, yes.
Hmm.
But it's tough. We all care what other people think.
Right.
And when it's something as personal as marriage, it can be hard to go against the grain.
Especially like you were saying earlier, in certain cultures where there are strong views about marriage and divorce.
Absolutely. Cultural norms are powerful. And then sometimes there are religious beliefs tied into it too.
Right, right. It's a lot to deal with. So how do you balance all of that? Like, how do you decide what matters more? Those external pressures or your own sense of what's right for you?
That's the question, isn't it? It comes back to knowing yourself, knowing what you value, like what's truly important to you in a relationship. Is it about looking good to other people? Or is it about having a partner who respects you, supports you, shares your values?
Hmm.
It's about putting your own well-being first, even if it means going against the expectations of others.
That takes a lot of courage, though. It's one thing to say, like, I don't care what people think, but it's another thing to actually live that way.
It's not easy. It's a process. And it
Boy.
often means, like, confronting beliefs that you've been taught your whole life,
Mm-hmm.
but it's worth it.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you deserve to be in a relationship that makes you happy, not one that you feel obligated to stay in.
Okay, so that's 6 reasons. And they've all been, pretty heavy. But we have one more to go. And it's kind of a catch-all, feeling like there's just too much to lose by leaving.
This one's tricky because the losses aren't always clear-cut.
Yeah.
It's not just about the material stuff like the house, the money, all of that. It's also about the emotional and social connections.
Like losing friends, family ties, that sense of belonging that comes with a long-term relationship.
Exactly. You've built this whole life together, and the thought of unraveling it can be really scary.
It's like this giant web, and you're afraid of what will happen if you pull on one thread.
That's a good way to put it. And those feelings are valid. It's
Mm.
important to acknowledge that. But the article had this really interesting suggestion. Make a list of what you might lose if you stay, and another list of what you might lose if you leave.
Hmm, that's interesting. I like that.
Yeah, it forces you to really face those fears head on.
Yeah.
And often what happens is that when people do this, they realize that the things they stand to lose by staying, like their happiness, their sense of self, their well-being, those things are actually bigger, more important than what they might lose by leaving.
And I remember the article had this really powerful example of a person who was staying because they didn't want to lose their lifestyle, but then they realized that what they were really losing was their sanity.
That's a perfect example. It shows that sometimes what you're giving up by staying in an unhappy relationship is more valuable than anything you might gain by leaving.
It's true. So we've gone through all 7 reasons, and it's clear that there's no simple answer. It's complicated. It's personal.
And it's important to remember that these reasons, they don't exist separately.
Mhm.
They're often all tangled up with each other.
Like a big knot you can't untangle.
Right. Which makes it even harder to figure out what to do. But I think the biggest thing we've talked about today is self-awareness
Right. Knowing yourself.
and being honest with yourself and knowing that it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good reminder that you have choices. You have the power to make decisions, even if they're scary.
Absolutely. You can take control of your life and do what's best for you.
It's about remembering that you deserve to be happy, and that sometimes means making tough choices. Choices that maybe other people won't understand or agree with.
And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to leave something behind that's no longer good for you, even if it's hard.
It's funny, thinking about all this, about unhappy relationships and why people stay. It makes me think that it's not just about romantic relationships, right? This could apply to, like, friendships, family stuff, even jobs where people feel stuck.
Oh, totally. I mean, those reasons we talked about, the fear, the denial, the financial pressure, worrying about what other people think, all of that, it shows up everywhere.
Yeah, it's like we fall into these patterns and it's hard to break free.
Exactly.
So it's not just about knowing when to end a romantic relationship. It's about being able to see those patterns in any part of your life where you're unhappy. Like checking in with yourself and asking, is this good for me? Am I taking care of myself?
That's it. It's about having the courage to really look at any situation, romantic or not, where you feel stuck, and asking those tough questions like, what am I getting out of this? And what am I losing by staying?
Yeah. And sometimes the answer to those questions is pretty obvious, but then actually doing something about it, that's a whole other thing. Change is scary even when you know it's the right thing to do.
Right. And that's where that active hope comes in again. It's
Yeah.
not enough to just wish things were different. You have to actually take steps to make it happen.
Mhm.
And sometimes that means getting help, talking to someone you trust, a therapist, a friend, whoever, someone who can give you a fresh perspective.
It's like that saying, if you want something you've never had, you have to do something you've never done.
Love that. It's about pushing yourself out of your comfort zone,
Yeah.
taking risks, challenging those habits that keep you stuck. It might be scary, but it's also empowering.
So if someone's listening to this right now and they're in a relationship that's making them unhappy, what's the one thing you would tell them?
If I had to pick just one thing, it would be to take care of yourself. Put your own well-being first. I know that might sound selfish, but it's not.
Hmm.
You can't give to others if you're running on empty.
Yeah, that's true.
So be good to yourself. Listen to your feelings, your values, what you really want out of life.
It's about choosing yourself, even when it's hard, even if it means leaving behind something that you thought was going to last forever.
Yeah, because sometimes walking away is the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for the other person. It creates space for something new, something better, something that really fits who you are.
That's a great way to put it. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into, well, the not so fun side of relationships, I think the main takeaway for me is that it's all about self discovery. It's about learning to trust yourself, to listen to your needs, and to have the courage to create a life that makes you happy.
Absolutely. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are people out there who can help, who understand. So reach out, ask for support, and never give up on finding happiness.
Such an important message. And for everyone listening, as you think about everything we've talked about, I want you to ask yourself, what does a happy and fulfilling relationship look like to you? What can you do starting today to make that happen? Whether it's working on your current relationship or maybe starting fresh with something new.
Because you deserve a life full of joy and connection with people who truly get you. And sometimes that starts with having the courage to walk away from what's no longer working.
That's a great thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some things to think about and maybe even inspired you to create relationships that really bring you joy.